One spark. That's all it took to turn a pirate ship into a floating coffin. Yet somehow, these crews stored enough gunpowder to level entire ports right beneath their feet for months at sea. The storage method they used defies everything we know about maritime safety, but there's a twisted reason it actually worked. Life at sea wasn't exactly a Caribbean vacation for pirates. Sure, they had treasure maps and fancy hats, but they also had a massive problem that Hollywood never talks about: running out of gunpowder at the worst possible moments. Every successful raid depended on firepower. Cannons needed to blast merchant ships into surrender. Pistols had to fire when boarding enemy vessels. Muskets were essential for defending against naval patrols. Without gunpowder, pirates were basically floating around with expensive metal clubs and really loud voices. But here's where things got tricky. Buying gunpowder from legitimate sources was like walking into a police station wearing a shirt that says, "I steal things for a living." Most port authorities kept strict records of who purchased explosive materials. Pirates showing up with gold coins asking for barrels of gunpowder raised more red flags than a Chinese New Year parade. Even when pirates managed to buy or steal gunpowder, keeping it usable was a nightmare. Ships leaked constantly. Salt spray covered everything. Humidity turned powder into useless gray paste faster than you could say, "Avast ye mateys." One bad storm could ruin months' worth of carefully stored ammunition. The ocean didn't care about your pirate schedule either. Ships spent weeks or months between port visits. During long voyages, crews watched their gunpowder supplies dwindle while praying they wouldn't encounter Spanish warships or rival pirates. Running low on ammunition meant choosing battles very carefully. Smart captains tried stocking up whenever possible, but storage space was limited. Food, water, and rum took priority over everything else. Pirates needed to eat and drink to stay alive, but they also needed firepower to stay free. This balancing act drove many crews to desperate measures. Then there were the accidents. Gunpowder exploded when it got too close to lanterns, cooking fires, or careless smokers. Pirates lost fingers, hands, and sometimes entire ships to powder explosions. The stuff that kept them alive in battle could kill them just as easily during peaceful moments. Some crews tried rationing their gunpowder, saving it only for the biggest targets. Others gambled everything on single raids, hoping to capture enough supplies to last until the next opportunity. Both strategies had obvious flaws. Weather made everything worse. Tropical storms soaked through supposedly waterproof containers. Desert heat dried out powder until it barely sparked. Cold temperatures affected how well the mixture burned. Mother Nature seemed determined to disarm every pirate on the seven seas. The smart pirates realized something important early on. Depending on others for gunpowder was a recipe for disaster. They needed to become self-sufficient. They had to learn how to make their own explosive materials using whatever they could find. This led them down a path that involved some truly creative thinking and one particularly disgusting ingredient that every crew member could contribute to daily. Getting gunpowder meant finding saltpeter first. Without this white crystalline substance, pirates might as well have been throwing sand at their enemies. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate if you want to get fancy about it, was the explosive heart of every gunpowder recipe. The stuff made up 3/4 of the mix and delivered the bang that sent cannonballs flying. Here's where things got tricky for our seafaring criminals. Saltpeter didn't just wash up on beaches like driftwood or seashells. The ingredient came from land-based sources, often found in caves, old buildings, or places where organic matter had been decomposing for years. Pirates spent most of their time floating around oceans surrounded by endless water that couldn't help them make a single grain of usable powder. Well, this created a nasty catch-22 situation. Pirates needed saltpeter to make gunpowder, but they rarely had access to the places where it naturally occurred. Some crews tried buying the stuff at ports, but that brought its own set of problems. Walking into a colonial town and asking for large quantities of saltpeter was like announcing you were up to no good. Makes sense, right? Authorities weren't exactly welcoming to suspicious characters stockpiling explosive materials. Then there was the cost factor. Saltpeter wasn't cheap, and pirates often operated on tight budgets between successful raids. Spending precious silver on ingredients meant less money for food, rum, and other necessities. Plus, many merchants refused to sell to obvious pirates or charged outrageous prices when they did. The smart pirate captains realized they needed to become self-sufficient. Relying on others for such a critical resource was dangerous business. What happened when they couldn't find a willing seller? What about when they were being hunted by naval forces and couldn't risk entering civilized ports? These crews needed backup plans that didn't depend on the kindness of strangers. Some pirates resorted to raiding other ships specifically for their gunpowder supplies, but this was like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Eventually, you'd run out of targets carrying what you needed. The really clever ones started looking for alternative methods to produce their own saltpeter. They had to get creative with whatever materials they could find aboard their ships. The most desperate crews even attempted trading with indigenous peoples on remote islands, offering stolen goods in exchange for any materials that might contain nitrates. But these deals were unreliable and often unsuccessful since many island communities had no use for European-style weapons or explosives. And the weird part is, the solution to this saltpeter shortage was floating right there with them every single day. Pirates just had to look in an unexpected place, one that required absolutely zero trips to sketchy merchants or dangerous port towns. The answer was literally aboard their ships, being produced by their own crew members around the clock. Well, turns out pirates had one resource that never ran short on a ship full of men drinking rum and ale for months at sea: their own piss. And before you wrinkle your nose, this wasn't some desperate last resort. It was actually brilliant chemistry disguised as gross necessity. Pirates would set up special barrels just for collecting urine. Every crew member contributed daily to what became known as the piss pot. The smell alone could knock you overboard, but smart captains knew this liquid gold was their ticket to homemade gunpowder. After weeks of collection, they'd have gallons of the stuff sloshing around below deck. But here's where it gets interesting. You can't just pour pee into a cannon and expect it to fire. The magic happened when pirates mixed their collected urine with whatever organic waste they could find. Rotted straw, animal manure from livestock they kept on board, and old soil scraped from previous landfalls. This disgusting cocktail created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria that would slowly transform waste into nitrates. The same nitrates found in expensive saltpeter sold at ports. Pirates essentially turned their toilet into a chemical factory, and the weird part is, it actually worked incredibly well. The crew had to tend these stinking beds like gardeners. Daily stirring was essential to keep the bacteria happy and productive. Someone had to feed the mixture regularly with fresh organic matter. Guess who got stuck with this job? Usually the newest crew member or whoever had recently ticked off the captain. Being appointed pee collector was basically a floating punishment that lasted weeks. The process took around a month of constant attention. Pirates would stir, add materials, and wait while their floating laboratory slowly converted waste into weapon-grade chemicals. The smell was so bad that some crews had to work shifts just to avoid passing out from the fumes. Then, there's the quality issue. This homemade saltpeter wasn't quite as potent as the refined stuff sold by legitimate merchants. Testing showed it reached about 70% of the strength you'd get from expensive store-bought saltpeter. But when you're facing down a Navy warship with empty cannons, 70% beats 0% every single time. Pirates got creative with their waste management too. Some crews discovered that certain foods made their urine more effective for saltpeter production. Others experimented with different ratios of straw and manure to maximize output. What started as basic survival evolved into an actual science, complete with techniques passed down from captain to crew. The beauty of this method was its sustainability. As long as pirates kept eating and drinking, they'd never run out of raw materials. But collecting and processing urine was just the first step. Once they had their homemade saltpeter brewing, they faced the tricky challenge of extracting pure crystals from their floating waste factory. Getting the saltpeter crystals out of that disgusting mixture wasn't exactly rocket science, but it required patience that most pirates didn't have. The nitrate-rich slop had to be filtered through cloth or old sailcloth to separate the liquid from the chunky bits. Think about straining soup, except this soup could kill you if you messed it up. The filtered liquid went straight into water barrels, where the real waiting game began. Pirates stirred this concoction constantly, sometimes for days at a time. The stirring wasn't optional either. Without it, the saltpeter crystals wouldn't form properly at the bottom. And the weird part is, the more you stirred, the better the crystals got. After 3 to 5 days of nonstop stirring, tiny white crystals started appearing at the bottom of the barrels. These weren't just any crystals, they were pure saltpeter gold. The pirates had to be incredibly careful during this stage because one wrong move could ruin weeks of work. Makes sense, right? You don't want to lose your only chance at making gunpowder. But here's where things got tricky on a crowded ship. Space was already tight, and now you had barrels of stinking liquid taking up valuable room. The crew had to work around these barrels while still managing daily ship duties. Some captains got creative and assigned the least useful crew members to stirring duty. Better to keep them busy than have them causing trouble elsewhere. Well, once the crystals formed, the liquid had to be carefully drained off without disturbing the precious white powder at the bottom. Pirates used makeshift siphons made from hollow reeds or copper tubes to suck out the liquid. The remaining crystal-rich sludge was then spread on flat wooden boards to dry in the sun. The drying process was absolutely critical. Any moisture left in the saltpeter would ruin the final gunpowder. Pirates learned to cover their drying crystals with canvas during unexpected rain showers. They also discovered that sea air made drying take twice as long, so timing was everything. Then, there was the security issue. Other crew members might try to steal the finished saltpeter to sell at the next port. Some pirates literally slept next to their drying crystals to prevent theft. The paranoia was real because saltpeter was more valuable than rum on some ships. Most captains preferred doing this entire extraction process when anchored near quiet shores, away from prying eyes. Authorities at busy ports would ask too many questions about barrels of mysterious white crystals. Pirates needed secrecy to avoid unwanted attention from naval patrols or rival crews who might want to steal their hard work. Once the saltpeter was completely dry and stored safely, pirates faced their next challenge, finding the other ingredients needed to complete their deadly gunpowder recipe. Getting your hands on saltpeter was only half the battle. Now comes the part where pirates turned into chemists, and where one wrong move could blow your face clean off. The recipe itself wasn't exactly a state secret. 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. Simple math, deadly results. But here's where things get interesting. Pirates didn't have fancy measuring tools or perfect ingredients like the gunpowder makers back on land. Charcoal was actually the easiest part to handle. Pirates scraped it straight from burnt wood stores on their ships or gathered it from campfires when they anchored near quiet shores. Some crews got creative and burned specific types of wood that produced better charcoal. Willow and alder were favorites when they could find them. The key was getting it ground down to the finest powder possible. Sulfur presented its own headaches. Lucky pirates might stumble across volcanic islands where sulfur deposits sat right there for the taking. Others had to pilfer supplies from merchant ships or trade for it at sketchy ports where no questions got asked. The smart captains always kept extra sulfur locked away because it was harder to replace than charcoal. Then came the mixing process, and this is where pirates separated the brave from the foolish. These three ingredients had to be pounded and blended into the finest powder you could imagine. Too coarse and your gunpowder wouldn't ignite properly. Too rough with the grinding and boom, you're missing fingers or worse. Pirates used mortars and pestles when they had them, but most crews made do with whatever they could find. Some used the flat sides of cutlasses to grind ingredients on smooth planks. Others fashioned grinding tools from spare metal and wood scraps. The whole process took hours of careful, patient work. Safety wasn't exactly their strong suit, but even pirates knew certain rules. No metal tools that might spark, no open flames anywhere nearby. Some crews even stripped down to avoid static from their clothes. Imagine that scene on a crowded ship deck. The weird part is how many pirates actually got good at this. Experienced powder makers could tell just by feel when the mixture was right. They'd test tiny pinches to see how it burned, adjusting the recipe based on the quality of their homemade saltpeter. But accidents happen more often than anyone wanted to admit. Ship's logs from captured pirate vessels mention crew members losing fingers, hands, or worse during powder mixing sessions. One wrong move, and half your crew could be picking splinters out of their faces. The successful batches got treated like liquid gold, because that's essentially what they were. Fresh gunpowder meant the difference between taking a prize ship or becoming fish food. But making it was just step one. Keeping it dry and safe in the middle of the ocean, that's where pirates had to get really creative with their storage methods. Making gunpowder was just half the battle. The real nightmare? Keeping it dry and stable while your ship got tossed around by storms, soaked by ocean spray, and rocked by cannon fire from enemy vessels. Pirates faced a deadly puzzle every single day. One spark near the powder room meant instant death for the entire crew. But keeping gunpowder too far away during a fight meant you'd run out of ammunition before you could reload your cannons. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. The smartest captains built special powder rooms deep in the ship's belly, as far from the deck as possible. These tiny chambers got sealed tighter than a miser's purse. No metal tools allowed inside. No lanterns or candles either. Pirates had to feel around in complete darkness, handling barrels by touch alone. Makes sense, right? One accidental spark would turn your ship into floating fireworks. Then there's the clothing situation. Crew members assigned to powder duty wore nothing but wool or linen. No metal buttons, no belt buckles, not even metal shoe nails. Why? Static electricity from rough fabric could create just enough spark to ignite the whole supply. Some paranoid captains made their powder handlers strip down to their underwear before entering the magazine. Old wine casks became the gold standard for gunpowder storage. These barrels already had tight seals from holding liquid, making them naturally waterproof. Pirates would line them with extra tar or wax, creating an airtight seal that kept moisture out for months at sea. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Containers that once held celebrations now stored destruction. But here's where things got really tricky. Pirates couldn't just lock up all their gunpowder and forget about it. During battle, crew members had to sprint back and forth between the powder room and the cannons, carrying measured amounts in leather pouches. Too much powder in one trip risked losing everything in a single accident. Too little meant multiple dangerous journeys through a ship under attack. Trust became everything in powder management. Captains handpicked their most reliable crew members for magazine duty. These weren't just any sailors. They were men who'd proven themselves calm under pressure and careful with their hands. Some captains even posted guards outside powder rooms during port visits, worried that drunk crew members might stumble in with lit pipes. The paranoia reached ridiculous levels on some ships. Certain captains banned smoking anywhere below deck. Others required crew members to remove their shoes before approaching the powder room, worried that nail-studded soles might scrape against metal and create sparks. All this careful storage meant nothing if pirates couldn't access their gunpowder when they needed it most. And when desperation hit during long voyages or intense battles, these sea rogues developed some truly wild backup plans that would make even seasoned sailors shake their heads in disbelief. When everything went wrong at sea, pirates had to get creative with their gunpowder situation, and trust me, desperation made these guys inventive in ways that would make modern engineers cringe. Take damp gunpowder, for instance. Most people would throw it overboard and call it a loss. Not pirates. They'd spread the soggy mess on canvas sheets under the blazing Caribbean sun, hoping to salvage whatever explosive power remained. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it fizzled like a wet firecracker when they needed it most. But hey, desperate times called for desperate measures. The legendary Blackbeard and his crew aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge took the urine collection method to absolutely ridiculous levels. Historical records suggest they collected over 100 gallons of crew urine during a single voyage. That's roughly 800 pints of pee, folks. The smell alone probably scared off enemy ships before the cannons even fired. Can you imagine being the poor sailor assigned to manage that floating toilet factory? Then there's the scrap metal solution. When proper cannonballs ran out, pirates would cram anything metal into their cannons. Nails, chains, broken tools, even kitchen utensils became deadly projectiles. One documented case involved pirates loading a cannon with an entire bag of rusty spoons they'd stolen from a merchant vessel. Imagine explaining that injury to a ship's doctor. But the real desperation showed during extended blockades or when marooned. Pirates would dig through old battlefields on remote islands, searching for spent gunpowder residue in the dirt. They'd collect this contaminated soil, then run it through their makeshift filtration process, hoping to extract enough saltpeter for one last fight. Competition for gunpowder supplies led to some of the most violent raids in pirate history. Ships would attack merchant vessels not for gold or jewels, but specifically for their powder stores. Pirates knew that gunpowder meant survival, while treasure meant nothing if you couldn't defend it. The weird part is how successful these crude methods actually were. Pirates using homemade gunpowder successfully fought off naval forces, captured heavily armed merchant ships, and maintained their reign of terror for decades. Their DIY approach to explosives kept them in business when traditional supply chains failed. Some captains became so paranoid about running out of gunpowder that they'd hoard multiple barrels of the homemade stuff, creating floating bombs that could obliterate their own ships if hit wrong. One spark in the wrong place and boom, instant underwater grave. These desperate gunpowder tactics reveal something crucial about pirate ingenuity. They weren't just criminals sailing around stealing things. They were survival experts who turned human waste into weapons of war, transformed kitchen scraps into deadly ammunition, and kept fighting even when the entire world wanted them dead. Their gunpowder methods kept them dangerous, relevant, and absolutely terrifying to anyone unlucky enough to spot their black flags on the horizon.